Alberta, thank you so much for joining us in this interview. I have just one question. A few months ago, you told me one inspired and powerful story about how your family came to Jesus and how the school played one important part on this. I'd like to hear this story again.
Well, I'll do my best. This is the story of David Patterson. He came from Ireland, Dublin, Ireland. It's a story of extreme angst and poverty that ended up being a story of triumph of God's love. David's parents, Mary and David, lived in downtown Dublin. They got married, Presbyterian people, and her parents did not want the marriage. She was marrying below her station in life. She was disinherited. So they were together and they had a number of children. We're not sure how many the older ones were, but there was an older daughter, and then there was David, and there was Sam. Now, when David was 3 years old, the father died. And you got to remember, this was in like 1888. There was no Social Security. There was no welfare. There was nothing. And women didn't work full time, even. So she had these 3 small children and no way to earn a living. She farmed them out to somebody in the country, and they kind of grew up with the other family's children, and she had some kind of a connections because she was able to work somewhere. The older daughter died. See, the father died of TB, the older daughter died of TB. When the boys got old enough to go to school, they were sent to, David was sent to the Blue Coat School, which was a charity school, boarding school, attached to a hospital. This was influenced the rest of his life. Whereas Sam was sent to the Masonic school. Now you can tell right now where this is going. Sam was a Mason way up in the hierarchy of Masonry in Canada. David became a follower of Jesus and raised his children that way. So both of these boys went to these boarding schools. David was taught, this was his education, to be a gentleman. So he had Latin, Greek, mathematics, manners. You know, he was going to be a gentleman. Well, he was top student all along. The last year he was in school, the next year he was to be head boy. Well, David was a man that was short. He was a small man, and this was the way it was in Europe at that time. He was afraid that the younger ones would beat him up, basically. So he absconded and he went to Canada. In Canada, he taught school for a couple of years, and then he found out he was showing symptoms of tuberculosis like his father had. So he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, you know, there was no antibiotics back then. The only treatment was to go into a sanitarium. So the doctor said, go west. It's a higher altitude, cleaner air. You should be okay there. And so that's what he did. He found a job out there at a ranch. And when we were kids, we had to hear we heard these stories. He was a cowboy. So we had asked him, well, did you have 6 guns? 2 guns? He gets this little Irish twinkle in his eye. I say, yeah, I did. So they herded cattle. He said, one day I decided I would never shoot anybody. I took them out and threw them under a cactus. Now, whether it's even partway true, I have no idea. But he was on this ranch. He spied one of the cooks, which was a young lady whom he thought was beautiful. And they formed a relationship and they got married. I think they got married in like 1911. Well, now what do they do now? Because there were no factories to go get a job, you know. So the girl, Susie, her sister was down in Bend, Oregon, and said, you know, there is a farm near where we are that the owner's looking for somebody to take care of it. And so they went down to Bend, Oregon, and they had cattle, cows, milk cows, vegetables, etc., etc. And they had 2 sons there, my father, Robert, and the younger son, Philip. And they stayed there 5 years. Well, they got ready to go back up into Canada. They were ready to sell the cows. The cows were tested for tuberculosis. They had tuberculosis. They had to be destroyed. These were the milk cows. So they lost everything with that. Okay, so while they were there, the house that the owner lived in before they left was fully furnished. David loved to read. There was a bookcase in the living room with all these books in it, and he read them all. Would you believe his favorite book of all of the books that he read was called The Great Controversy by Ellen G. White? They read it, then they read it. Susie read it with him, and they decided to be Sabbath keepers. So they had been there for 5 years, and they went, because of the loss of the cattle and everything, he never had cows again because he could transfer the TB from himself to the cattle. So they went up into Saskatchewan, where the owner of this place that they were at was a minister, and he was working in Saskatchewan. And so they went up there and became baptized, became church members, became loyal church members. And they had kind of a, you know, Susie and David had kind of a hard life up there. They did different things. David cleared land for somebody else. That was hard work. They fished the Great Slave Lake in northern Saskatchewan. They fished, they dried the fish. That's part of what they ate. So then eventually they moved back into Alberta, and they had more children along the way. But they were Seventh-day Adventists from that time out. When they moved back to Alberta, they moved about 20 miles away from where Canadian Junior College started. My father would ride a pony, a horse, from their house to the school and go to school there all week long and then ride back on Friday. After a period of time, they had more children. They sent the children to church school there. They were examples in the community. You see, you know, we're talking after World War II, there was no church on each corner anywhere. When I first went up there with my parents, The church at the college was the church around. There was not another Adventist church to go to. So they met either in like a hall in a town or somebody's home. So it's a real tight-knit community of people. And we're known for their good works, their abstinence in their living, all of these attributes that we take for granted nowadays. They were pioneers in doing those things. At a certain time, when he was farming, he came up with having TB again. And this was when he was like in his late 50s. And the thing that they did was he was sent to a sanitarium. He spent 3 years in a sanitarium away from his family. His son, the youngest one, which was 18 years younger than my father, was just a teenage boy at that time. And he hated it that his father was taken away from him. Didn't get to see his father all those years. During the time that David was in the TB sanitarium, his wife was left on the farm with 3 children underfoot. They're teenagers, they're young people. And this was kind of a World War II, kind of in that era. She couldn't manage the farm by herself. The big tractor that they had broke down, and she finally got it fixed. Well, she ended up then selling the farm while he was in the sanitarium, and they moved over to the CUC campus right next to it, and there was a house there that her oldest son and her, they bought it with the property, and then they built a small house next to it. And so then the girls could go to school. Cliff, the youngest, could go to school there at CUC. And she operated a small store there. You're back to, there was no Social Security disability at that time. Her husband, the breadwinner, was gone. There was no income. It's just tough, really, really tough. And that's when the tough get going. She ran this little store for years, and she would go into Calgary, and there was a vendor in there that would give her things at a discount. And the students would come down and buy needles, handkerchiefs, treats, things like that. And that's how they kept their body and soul together while Dad was in the sanitarium. He came out of the sanitarium. They were around, and then they were around different towns around in Alberta. It was a very rural society, very small towns. There were no factories, very different. If you go to Canada today, you go to Alberta, it's a bustling place with a lot of commerce, a lot of opportunities for young people. Back then it wasn't that way. It was pretty sparse to have a job even. But when he retired, his one daughter had moved out to British Columbia, and there was an Adventist there that had a lumber mill. And he hired a lot of Adventist people, and they actually had a small church building, and they had a school there. It was a nice community. So my grandma and grandpa moved out there next to the daughter. It was interesting to go see him, and I even saw Uncle Sam there a couple of times, because he was a vigorous man. After all this time, he had had 2/3 of his lungs removed. He was in the higher altitude of the mountains, and I couldn't keep up with him. So this is the triumph of clean living, the good diet, and the active lifestyle. He died when he was 85. And to me, that's just the triumph of God's love over somebody who wanted to serve God. They raised 6 children. They've had education of different standards, different amounts, you know, between the girls and the guys. The youngest one, Cliff, my favorite uncle, went to Africa as a missionary. He worked for ADRA there. I say that's a triumph. That's a story to remember of how God led this dear couple, you know, twists and turns in life for them, and how they triumphed over it.